Labdien visiem! Patīk, ka jūs šeit esat. Mans vārds ir Dārzs Īvans. Es šodien stāstu priekšā mūsu viesi, Connie Fieldu, amerikāņu režisori, ļoti labu režisori. Sieviete, kas ir uzņēmusi vairākas pasaules slavenas filmas un guvusi lielu atzinību. Man ir prieks, ka tas notiek laikā, kad Rīga vispār ir kļuvusi par tādu nelielu dokumentālā kino pulsācijas vietu, jo tāpēc, ka vienlaikus notiek Baltijas fórums dokumentālajām filmām. Tas nozīmē, ka šeit pulsējās patiešām nozīmīgākie centrāla Eiropas un Austruma Eiropas režisori un arī cilvēki, kuri ir ieinteresēti atbalstīt dokumentālo kino. Vienlaikus sākās Arsenāla festivāls, kurā būs atsevišķas dokumentālās filmas, un arī Connie ir ar mums, un tas arī ir liels notikums, jo patiešām viņas daļa ir bijusi tāda ļoti plaša, tādā nozīmē, ka viņi ir atstājusi nozīmīgu ieguldījumu tieši sociālo dokumentālo filmu tradīcijā, un šajā ziņā ir jāpiemina vairākas viņas filmas. Viena no svarīgākajām viņas filmām, kas arī ir guvusi lielu atzinību, ir Rozijas Kniedētājas dzīve un laiki. Tas ir filma par amerikāņu sieviešu tiesībām strādāt darbus, kas patiesībā ir paredzēti kā vīriešiem, principā tāds feminismu uzplaukums pēc otrā pasaules kara sakarā ar sievietēm, kurām vajadzēja kara laikā pildīt vīriešu darbus. Tad otra filma, kur noteikti ir jāpiemina, tā patiešām ir ļoti sarežģīti veidot un tāda fundamentāla filma saucās Brīvība manā prātā, kas ir filma par 60. gadu sākumu Mississippi štatā un melnādaino amerikāņu cīņu par savām tiesībām. Šī filma tika nominēta Oskar balvai kā filmetrāžu dokumentālā filma. Šī filma ieguva Sundensā galveno žūrijas balvu un tiešām tāds nozīmīgs ieguldījums. Tajā jau ņemot vērā to, ka patiešām šajās režisors veidotajās filmās vienmēr ir apkopots milzums arhīvu materiālu, ļoti neredzētu arhīvu materiālu, tādas lietas, ko ikdienas skatītājiem vienmēr ir pārsteidzoši redzēt. Turklāt viņas ir veidotas ar lielu skrupulozitāti, tādu patiešām skaidru domu par to, kas tiek pateikts, un tā patiešām ir ļoti nozīmīgas sociālas tēmas, par kurām tiek runāts. Un šodien viņi mums pati pastāstīs par projektu, kas ir saistīts ar apartīdu režīmu un cīņu pret apartīdu Dienvidāfrikā. Tas ir liels fundamentāls arī projekts, kas sastāv no 7 filmām, bet par to Connie pat izteiks. So, it's your turn now. Introduce you. So now maybe something about the Johannesburg project.
Something about the series.
Es ceru, ka visi saprot. Angļu valodā mums nav jātulko.
Okay, and the film I'm going to show is part of a larger series of 7 films. It's 8.5 hours long, the whole series. I made 4 of the episodes feature length. I made 3 of them hour length. They're also cut down to 52 minutes for European TV, who demand that it's that length. But and the story is about the global movement involved in trying to end apartheid in South Africa. And the reason I got interested in it was because I feel, we really live in a globalized world, and our problems that we face in our societies are faced all over the world, and we're not going to be able to solve them unless we do it on that level. Everything's just too entwined. Our economies are too entwined. The way labor works and all of that. So it's, and this was basically a global story about changing something that, changing something that most people believed was going to end in a bloodbath. I mean, literally with people killing each other to death in civil war, and it didn't end that way. And it didn't end that way partly because of the people who were struggling. I think the African National Congress, which is Nelson Mandela's organization, I'm sure you all know who Nelson Mandela is. I think everybody in the world knows that. I think they were probably one of the smartest liberation movements to be able to harness the power of the rest of the world towards what they wanted to achieve. I think they did a better job of that than almost anybody has done. And the series that I made is about one part of that, and that's what the international world did and the effect it had inside South Africa. And I actually, it's a huge story. I covered 12 countries in over 50 years. It's really big. I'm very interested in how the world works politically and all those things, so it could keep my attention for all that time. And plus I have a very young staff and it kept theirs, so we found it interesting. But it's an extraordinary story. Another way I describe it, it's a portrait really of the world's march towards a global morality. The story really encompasses that. It begins really at the beginning of the United Nations and with the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which was trying to set a tone, for humanity and the whole world after the catastrophe of World War II. And that's exactly the same year that the National Party, with the Afrikaners, came into power in South Africa and really instituted apartheid. It was that same year. And then it's like they go off in one direction and the world goes off in another. So it's an ideal, I deal a lot with macro-micro relationships, because I deal with what went on at the UN, what people were doing on the ground inside South Africa, and what ordinary citizens did in many countries around the world. That story was heavily impacted by the Cold War. It really got in the way of everything the ANC was trying to do, and it affected a lot. And South Africa was a big ally of the United States around Cold War issues. And the South Africans had a lot of very strong economic relationships to the United States and England. And in those countries where that geopolitical, relationship was primary, it really took the citizens inside those countries to make things move. In the story in the United States, it took a big mass movement, and a lot of it was spearheaded by African Americans. In our country, it's a great story about how it's the first time African Americans really changed U.S. foreign policy. It was over this issue, and forced the government to sanction South Africa. And without going into more details, but it ended up not a bloodbath. And the tactics that really won that struggle were nonviolent. Even though the ANC had a guerrilla army, because people all over southern Africa then were fighting that way, and they weren't given any legitimate means to have a political movement. That was really ended in 1960 when their organizations were banned and they went underground. There could be no demonstrations, so they saw no other way to do it but that. But it really didn't function very much. They were really far away from South Africa. South Africa had the biggest military on the entire continent. I mean, it was just, it never really would have worked. But I think psychologically it helped young people in that country to think that, oh, there's somebody out there fighting for us or whatever. But it was really the nonviolent things that won. And a lot of the things that got done in the outside world really affected what happened in South Africa. And the story that I'm going to show now is a story about the sports boycott. What people were trying to isolate the white people in South Africa from the world. They were supposed to trying to do it culturally and economically and politically, and that was kind of the battle. To try to make those people feel that, look, what you're doing really is not acceptable in our world, and you have to change. And we're not going to play ball with you until you do that. And so this is totally just about the sports campaign. It was very successful. It was the first international arena where they kind of won, and it's an interesting story, I think. So I'd be glad to talk about it afterwards. Anybody have any questions about the context? Do people here know a lot about apartheid?
I'm not sure. Maybe kāds ir jūs zināšanas par apartīdu?
Yes, no? You just speak up. Yes or no, or maybe, or nobody wants to say? Are you too embarrassed to say no?
We know the fact, but nothing more. We know probably what is happening, but probably that's all, not some deeper facts.
Okay, well, I don't think this episode has a ton of. This one really takes place outside of South Africa for the most part. But, so in a nutshell, it was racism that was codified in the legal system, okay? And it was, people had laws so that if people were black, they lived one place. If you were Indian, you lived another place. If you were colored, you lived another. I mean, down to almost every category of people were separated. And you were not allowed to intermarry. And the Africans got it the worst, and they were forced onto called homelands that the South African government had some kind of vision that these would be independent countries, even though it was on 13% of the land, and they had 83% of the rest, and this was the most barren land, and nobody could get jobs there, so all the Africans had to come into this too. Basically, they lived in townships around the white cities that were like workers' enclaves. Some of them were barracks, but everybody had their families, and they had to carry passbooks to go anywhere. It was a pretty wicked society that way, and it was. What's interesting about it is that hardly anybody in the rest of the world supported apartheid. Okay, so you've got a situation where everybody's against this thing, and so the question is, why don't they do anything? What's stopping them from doing it? So the story I tell also shows you that. Here is something that everybody condemns. I mean, this was condemned at the United Nations as a crime against humanity. It was badly condemned. And so throughout the whole story, you begin to see what was in the way of anybody really helping to change that. So